So I'm going to talk for a few more minutes, only 9 more minutes, and then Padraic is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be very quick audience questions. But very first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the life of Finbar Cafferty, who is an Achill man who was killed recently in Ukraine. And for those that don't know him, he dedicated his life to fighting for justice and equality, and the world is much better because of him. A lot of people might know so I'm from Dugort, a few miles over the road, and I grew up blissfully ecologically blind. Like, I loved the landscapes, and I still do, but I thought they were perfect. And the way I bonded with the landscapes was things like turf cutting, not actually with the sleighing, but saving the turf, cutting achen for the bonfires in June. I loved the fields of sheep. I would cut thistles, pull ragwort if I was told, and it felt good. It felt like I was improving something, and it did foster a real sense of connection in me for the land. And I had always, forever, had this feeling of kinship with animals, fish, bugs, birds, but it took me an awful long time to put their welfare with their ecosystems. So I always knew birds need trees, but I would forget birds also need insects. Insects need clean water. They need stagnant water. They need a certain soil pH. So realizing birds need ecosystems was quite a change for me. I know that kind of might sound a bit stupid. And I can't remember the moment when I started making those connections. I started to see fragments of ecosystems everywhere. I started to see vital cycles interrupted, like hedgerows cut in September, just when all the berries are needed. I started to see the beautiful rhododendron that lined the Allery coming in as actually an invasive species choking out some pines that I often wonder about. Are they old? It was, and I'm not being dramatic, but it was excruciating. And I think anyone who's kind of gone through that, realizing what they see, it can be excruciating. Like recognizing that the hills and cliffs I loved so much were like bare bones, is quite a shift in mindset to have. Like, they're stripped by sheep. They're very susceptible to gunner and rhododendron invasion. I think everyone, or a lot of people probably know that famous quote by Aldo Leopold, an American writer and conservationist, who said, "One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds." And it is true, except thankfully you're not alone. There's plenty of people, hundreds of people, who recognize that and are working to rectify that. And it did change everything once I started learning. And the more you learn, the more awful it can be. And realizing that the sea and ocean is a shadow of what it once was in terms of abundance. Even noticing myself, the size. Like, I don't eat fish, but a friend brought a lobster to me about 3 years ago. And I was like, "Oh, thanks very much." And it was so small. I was so upset. And obviously it was a nice gesture. But these kind of things, and that's something I've noticed in my life, the size of fish being caught. Seeing turf cutting and bog drainage go from one of my favorite times of year. Like, I always loved being there with my aunt, because she wouldn't let us go home until the larks stopped singing. And I don't know how people been there. They're singing mad, and then they just go dead silent. And then we could go home. And it'd be dark, like. But starting to see that for what it is, which is like a cutting, what it is ecologically, which is like cutting, drying, and burning of a precious, water-storing, life-giving ecosystem. So it was an awful kind of few years, I think, for me. And I believe that in the absence of finding alternative ways to interact with nature, we will either we will still stay feeling awful, or we will feel like a real sense of loss, because I think we do need to find alternative ways to bond. Because I do have a theory that aside from economic drivers, there's a really strong desire for nature contact and this bonding with land that actually drives a lot of these things that we still do, which is quite perverse, really. Like, it's been proven again and again, being outside in nature, being in the fresh air, and maybe not even nature, maybe semi-natural, maybe your lawn, you're still outside, you're still with other species. You know, it's good for you. And so many of us, our work is quite alienated from us, and doing something, you know, turning turf, spreading turf, it's one of the few times our work is there right in front of us, and it's really satisfying. And also, you know, turf saving has the added loveliness of working alongside family members that maybe you couldn't actually spend 6 hours with, but you can work beside them for that long. You know, heading up into mountains looking for sheep, digging drains. I contend that even mowing lawns serves this function for people. It gives them something to do outside for maybe a loss of knowing how to bond with the environment otherwise. And obviously there are other elements, like I said, like economic, different cultural attachments to like the morality of hard work and improving land or letting land go to waste. But I think we're all going to have to reimagine these things if we're to have a world that has, you know, vibrant life in it in about 50 years. And luckily there's lots of things to do. Like, I don't know, have anyone here tried to remove rhododendron? It is a lot of work. Orla knows. Me and Orla did it like in the rain on 1 January. Same as Gunnerra. It takes so long. Their seeds are everywhere as well. Collecting old sheep wire that's left all over the island. Blocking up drains, both man-made drains and drains that have started to cause from erosion from overgrazed peatland. There's loads of work to do. It's how do we kind of shift to start doing those jobs instead. And perhaps some jobs will never be replaced with less damaging jobs. Lawn mowing. You know, I've often thought, so there's one field at home we have excluded sheep from. And the first year that we did, we saw it has hundreds of those bog orchids. And I've been thinking, you know, maybe we could do something like have a little family picnic up there, and each person has to do research on one plant, and we could have a little micro, you know, nature tour or something. Or for some people, perhaps it would be something more spiritual, like creating shrines in fields that are being, you know, let go to waste, to recognize that yes, generations spent hundreds of hours making these fields green, and we're not abandoning them in dismissing that work. Rather, we're saying to those fields, to those people, to those generations that worked, you know, thank you for sustaining us for decades, sometimes centuries. But we're, you know, going to leave the land have some time for itself for a few years. Because I do think there has to be something other than walking away, or we have to conceive of it as something other than that. And it will be different for everyone. Like some people might just be content to take up bird watching. I don't know if I have the patience. But I like to think I maybe one day will have the patience. And whatever it is, whatever this kind of shift in conception of our relationship with the environment is, ecological education will have to be the bedrock of it all. And this will have to go from 3-year-olds all the way up to council workers, TDs. Our entire society really needs a big ecological education course. And with that, with something like that, hopefully we could create new traditions and new ways of bonding with the land that serve us without damaging nature, because that would be ideal, really. And now, without subjecting you to any more of my theories, I'm delighted to introduce Pádraic Fogarty, who many of you probably know. He is an ecologist and the campaigns officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust, a national conservation charity. He's author of the 2017 book, Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature, and is editor of Irish Wildlife magazine. And he's going to give a talk about biodiversity and the climate crisis, and afterwards we'll have a short discussion with questions from the audience. So thank you, Pádraic. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to Saoirse. Thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to come and speak to you today. As Saoirse mentioned, I work for the Irish Wildlife Trust, which is a non-governmental organisation. We were set up in 1979 by Eamon de Butler and Garrett van Gelderen. Some of you look like you have enough grey hairs to remember those names. They were pioneers of their time. They were part of the environmental movement as it was in the 1970s, which came to Ireland and was setting up organisations like the one I still work for, which kind of gives you an idea about how long we've been talking about these issues. Much of what I'm going to say to you today is not new. In fact, people have been saying it for decades at this stage. But anyway, I got into the area of biodiversity. Like Saoirse was saying, I grew up very near the Phoenix Park in Dublin and loved it, loved the freedom of it, the exploration, the fact that there were deer in it and squirrels and you could see, animals. But then later I realized what I'm looking at is, what am I looking at? Is it nature? I don't know. And the more I look at everything, the more this kind of crashing sense of, I don't know how to describe it even. Is it a sense of impending disaster? Is it a sense of self-delusion? And I say that in a collective sense, is kind of dawning on me. So I'm not going to pretend that the talk I'm about to give will end on a hopeful note. People don't bring me in for the smiles at the end of the evening. It is a serious topic. It's a serious discussion. But I think I'll echo what Michal said to us last night, was that we can do something about it. And ultimately, I don't come to talks like this if I was going to tell you that we're all doomed and we should go home and just start buying tins beans. There is a lot we could be doing, and this is ultimately the message that I will leave on. Anyway. Welcome to the planetary boundaries. You probably heard about climate change and how climate change is going to upend all of our lives. And the bad news is that climate change is just one of the planetary boundaries that we are crashing through at the moment, which collectively you might call a planetary crisis. I won't go through it in great detail, but basically what this graph is saying to you, and this is done by scientists in the Potsdam Institute in Germany, they're saying that there are a number of elements to the Earth system that has allowed for the fairly comfortable development of human civilization. And that beyond those limits, human civilization ceases to be comfortable, basically, is what it's saying. And you can see one of them is climate change, and some of them you may never even have heard of before. Novel entities, for instance, is talking about the amount of chemicals that have been produced that are in our environment. They're probably, many of them, sitting under your sink at home. We're spraying them on the fields, we're spraying them in the air, and we don't know what effect they're going to have because basically they're new. Some of them have to do with our use of water, change of land use, biodiversity. Biodiversity is the foundation upon which we all sit. The Earth is habitable, unlike Mars and Venus, because there is life on it. That almost sounds like it's completely self-obvious. But if there was no biodiversity on Earth, there would be no human civilization. And we depend upon biodiversity for that. So I don't want to dwell on this too long, but basically what I'm trying to say to you is we have a multi-crises, but they're all interconnected. This is called, this piece of work here basically describes work that was done by an economist called Kate Raworth in the UK. And she was looking at how we can marry the needs of human beings in our society and also the natural boundaries that we need to get into if we're going to have a safe living space for this and for future generations. And she called it the donut. So the outer ring of the donut are the planetary boundaries. The inner ring of the donut are about basically meeting our own needs as human beings, whether that's health and welfare, education, and so on. And so lots of countries don't meet basic human needs at the moment. There are too many people in the world who go to bed hungry or who can't send their children to school. And then there are countries like ours that, despite the social problems we have at the moment, are probably one of the best served countries in the world in terms of human welfare. And so this graph on the left shows you where Ireland is in terms of basically our human development versus breaching planetary boundaries. And you can see, you can't probably read the names of the countries, but all the rich countries in the West are up in the top right corner, and basically the poor countries in the global South are down here. And basically what this is saying to you is that we are living off the ecological riches of the earth at the expense of the poor people and less well-developed countries in the global South. Because we are basically meeting our human needs, but in Ireland we have crashed through all of our ecological boundaries. We are scrounging off the ecological riches of other parts of the world. And you can tell that when you go to the supermarket and you look at the back of a packet of anything that you wish to buy. It could be imported from the other side of the world. It's based on fossil fuels that are mined from other parts of the world. It might have contents of fish populations that are swimming around the Arctic. I mean, who knows basically what is in the products that we're buying. But this idea that we have exhausted our own ecological resources in Ireland, and so the only reason we manage to live the lifestyles that we do is because we are continuing to feed off those ecological resources in other parts of the world. Now, this is recognized by the United Nations in their Sustainable Development Goals, in that when these were published in 2015, they said that we're all developing countries. It's not sufficient to say that we're rich, we're providing well for our people, therefore we are developed, and it's for you guys in the Global South to catch up with us. No. We have to reduce our ecological footprint, and we have to allow those countries to develop in a way that meets the needs of their people. And basically what it's saying, it's about connection. It's exactly like what we were looking at out on the Mac here this morning with Micheál, where we were looking at the connection between not just the species in the ecosystem, but also the people who live in that ecosystem, the people who have lived in the past. We were looking at shell middens from people who lived on Achill Island thousands of years ago, and also connection to the people who have yet to come, basically our children, the generations who are going to be on Achill Island in 100 years' time. What will they have to face with? Now, just for some basic kind of reality check, this is the concentration of greenhouse of CO2, which is not actually the only greenhouse gases. There are others, and basically you can see for yourselves what has happened to CO2 concentrations. The latest data I got from the Guardian website does an update every day. It's 418.7 parts per billion. That just goes up and up and up and up every day, and it crashed through an all-time record there recently, because it does go down as well as up depending on the season. But basically we haven't seen greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere like this for hundreds of millions of years. And that means that one of the principal causes of it, it's not even the only cause, but one of the principal causes of it is an increase in global temperature. And you can see that that is not quite matching that ski jump style pattern, but it's getting there. And that's a real worry. And I just put this up here today. This is from a study from Nature. It looks like, you know, what happens when you try to put a wire onto a plug. But basically it's looking at what are the future scenarios. So what are we facing at? And basically it's saying as well, you know, what the future looks like really depends on the kind of action that we take today. If we took action, if we restore the ecosystems, if we cut out fossil fuels, well then we can see global temperatures peak and then start coming down. But if we stay on our business as usual trajectory, which is what we're on at the moment, then you can see we're on the dark red line here, which is going up to 5 degrees of warming over pre-industrial times. And people might say, well, you know, 5 degrees doesn't sound that bad. It might well have been a 5-degree difference this afternoon to what it was early this morning, and that didn't disrupt our lives. The problem is, if you look at Spain today, you will see that it is desertifying. People in Spain are literally running out of water. Ecosystems in Spain today are collapsing. They have beautiful wetland ecosystems where the water is just literally not there anymore. We see villages in France are being told you're not allowed to build any more houses because the water isn't there anymore. And that's, at the moment, we are at possibly 1.2 degrees of warming. So these effects are already unraveling. This is my city, and this is showing what the impact of 2 degrees of warming will be on the right-hand side and 4 degrees on the left. You will see that large parts of Dublin will need to be abandoned. In a 2-degree warming world, never mind the 4-degree warming world. Remember, the goal of the Paris Agreement was to keep global temperatures well below 2 and 1.5. Most observers would say that the 1.5 goal is not realistic anymore, that we've already crashed through that. And so these are the very real consequences that we're living with. Ireland, of course, these are CO2 gases per person. So a lot of what I hear all the time is, why should we do something? What about the people in China? What about Brazil? And the fact is that Ireland, people in Ireland are using way too much greenhouse gases through our energy system and our land use and other things. So a bit like what I was saying earlier about us really using more than our fair share. And so where do our greenhouse gases come from? This is particularly in Ireland. These are the most recent figures from the Environmental Protection Agency. And you can see that most of the greenhouse gases in Ireland are coming from our agricultural system. We have a very livestock dependent agricultural system, which releases methane in particular, but also nitrous oxides from fertilizer. We also have other areas as well. Our energy system, for instance, our transport, our homes, basically everything we do is fossil fueled. But I wanted to show you this. Now, I'm not asking you to read what's on this, but I want you to look at the shapes of the different graphs. And what this is describing, each of these little boxes are some kind of aspect of human civilization. And we have world population. We have fertilizer use. We have world tourism. And basically, you're seeing the same kind of ski jump style pattern that we saw for carbon dioxide emissions. And this has been repeated for, say, global fish extraction, for ocean acidification, for methane, and the number of large dams even on rivers. We're seeing this acceleration of nearly everything. And in response to that, we are seeing a deceleration of life on Earth and also global heating. And much of this is linked not just to use of greenhouse gases per se, but consumption. It's the amount of stuff that we use, because the stuff we use comes from somewhere. It has a land footprint, it has an energy footprint. And again, this is about the ecological footprint of different countries, and you can see that Ireland is up there. Like many countries in the global north, we're just consuming too much stuff. Anyway, that's the background. I wanted to move on more to biodiversity, because biodiversity is really my thing. But really what I wanted to emphasize was that the crisis we face at the moment is much more than just greenhouse gases. Now, the thing about greenhouse gases is you can measure them quite easily in the atmosphere. There are sensors that do that. We can also measure quite easily the amount of fossil fuels we use. We can measure the number of cows we have in the field. And so that makes it a relatively, and I say that advisedly, a relatively easy problem to manage, because you can say, well, if we do this, well, then it will result in this response. And that's why we have greenhouse gas reduction targets, and we can model that based on the warming that's needed, and the science is quite clear on it. Biodiversity is impossible to measure. We don't know frequently how to quantify it. We don't know how many species there are in Ireland. You know, yes, we have an idea of the thousands that have already been identified, but we know that that's changing. We don't know where they are. We know that biodiversity is constantly changing. We know that most of biodiversity is invisible. It's in the soil, it's in the water. So basically it's impossible to measure in the way that we measure greenhouse gases. And the other thing to note about biodiversity is that it's inherently complex. So it's not just that it's complicated. We might call, you know, how the engine in our car is complicated, but biodiversity is complex, which means that it's probably not even possible to understand biodiversity and how it works, because there are so many interactions. And that's why you see from this graph, everything does has an impact on the other species around it. And so what have we done to biodiversity? And this is a graph from, it's data produced by the World Wildlife Federation and the Zoological Society of London. They call it the Living Planet Index. Many of us refer to it as the Dying Planet Index. And it has looked at the populations of vertebrates. So vertebrates are animals with backbones. It includes ourselves, mammals, fish, birds, amphibians. It doesn't include insects or microbes or anything like that. And it's look at the population of those large animals that we're mostly familiar with since the 1970s. Now, 1970s is their start date, not the Garden of Eden in the 1970s, by the way. I was born in 1973. In my lifetime, the populations of these animals has dropped by nearly 3/4. I think it's around 70% was the most recent data from. Now it is, you could say, oh, well, it's leveling out. I mean, that's possibly because it's hit rock bottom. You know, this is, we also know, of course, that we have this phenomenon called insectageddon, which is probably most vividly portrayed by the, this anecdote that, you know, when we were all kids and we were driving across the country, we had to scrape the insects off our car windows, and we simply don't have to do that anymore. And of course, the insects are the nuts and bolts of many ecosystems. So we cannot live comfortably in a world where ecosystems are collapsing all around us. That is going to have consequences. So what I wanted to ask now with the remaining minutes that I have is, in Ireland, like, where has nature gone? Like Saoirse mentioned, I grew up in a more urban environment, but we used to go on holidays in the west of Ireland, and I was constantly told that the landscape was unspoilt. This is where nature is. And, you know, the corollary of that, of course, was that Dublin was spoilt, and where we live is spoilt, and only in places where not that many people live have remained unspoilt. But certainly in the 1950s, let's say the post-war period, we lived in a very different time. Now, if you go back further, and you'll learn more about this from Owen tomorrow, Ireland was once 80% forest, and the other 20% were other natural ecosystems. They were bogs, they were wetlands, rivers, and so on. Today, our natural forest is about 1% of our total land area. So if we're horrified, and many of us I'm sure are, about what's happening in the Brazilian Amazon at the moment, or the jungles of Southeast Asia that are being bulldozed to make, you know, soy or palm oil for our products, we should also be horrified at the fact that Ireland is probably the most deforested country in the world. And I'll explain why. Some people might say, oh, but we have, you know, all these Sitka spruce plantations. Technically, our tree cover in Ireland is around 12%. But they're not ecosystems in the same way that natural ecosystems are complex interactions with lots of plants and animals and fungi and so on. These are much, much simplified, and they're actually not our friends when it comes to protecting climate and biodiversity. But certainly a field like this in the 1950s, yes, it used to have forest on it. But in the 1950s, a farmer was not using pesticides. A field like this would have been full of flowers. It would have been full of insects. It probably had ground nesting birds in it, maybe corncrakes, maybe curlews, maybe lapwings that we saw this morning. And today, there's practically nothing. You might be lucky to see some buttercups in a field like this. It's not dead. You know, so this is an important point, that a collapsed ecosystem is not necessarily dead. It just means it's been completely transformed. And the biodiversity that was in it just isn't there anymore. And I'd say about 60% of Ireland is agriculture. We got some figures on this recently. And most of that agriculture is what people have referred to as improved grassland. And even the term improved grassland tells you a lot about the mentality that has gone into turning those nature-rich fields into basically fields of one type of grass. Now this is from the Wicklow Mountains. This is actually a national park, and we used to drive up here at the weekends when I was a child. I don't know, it was a kind of a half scary experience because I didn't know what we were supposed to do when we got there, because it's so open, and the weather was frequently terrible. But people used to live up here, quite like some of the very marginal areas we were looking at today in Achill. People used to live up in landscapes like this. These landscapes were also forested. The pollen record shows that landscapes like this were full of trees, maybe not dense oak forest that we might have got in the lowlands, but certainly birch, ash, mountain ash, and other kinds of trees, and full of wild animals as well. And today, this is what you'll see in our national park in Wicklow. And basically, there's nothing there. You might find Sika deer, which were imported from Japan 100 years ago by, I think it was Lord Powerscourt, decided he wanted to do something to liven up his front lawn and brought in these deer that are now all over the place. And you will find ravens, and the ravens are frequently there because they're feeding off the dead sheep that are, I don't know, they just fall into a gully and no one collects them. Most of the upland birds are now extinct from this area. The golden eagles, the golden plover, there are some red grouse. There are no curlews in this part of Ireland. This is the largest upland area in the country, and it's basically devoid of nature. What has happened actually since the people moved out is that the sheep moved in, but then the area has been progressively depopulated. It's become harder to maintain the sheep because the sheep don't like tall vegetation. And so what has happened is that combined with the fact that if you want to get your subsidies, your land has to be grazable. So the quickest way to get scrubby ground grazable is to set it on fire. So areas like this have been repeatedly burnt to the ground. And you'll see one of the main things that there was an older person said it to me about Connemara, was that we noticed that the hills used to be purple in summer from the heather, and now they're green. And that shows that even the heather is now gone, and what you're mostly looking at is a plant called Melinia, moorgrass, and it responds very well to fire. And a lot of time people will say, oh yeah, well it doesn't really matter if you set it on fire, look, the grass grows back really quickly. But really what has happened is that community of plants and animals has been replaced by another monoculture. If we move into our lowlands, we see that a lot of our rivers have been dredged. This is the River Boyne in County Meath. It's a special area of conservation, which is part of the Natura 2000 network that Micheál told us about yesterday. This has been artificially straightened, deepened, and embankments raised up on either side in order to create farmland, which it has done very successfully. But it has destroyed how the river works. Rivers are not supposed to flow in arrow-like straight lines. And what about our bogs? Most of our bogs were seen as a problem throughout our history, an impediment. And in the 1950s, we set up Bord na Móna to exploit the bogs, and there was great celebration that a combination of our ingenuity and new machinery could exploit the bogs. We set up 3 power stations in the country to burn them. One of them is still going, although we're not burning peat anymore. Instead, Bord na Móna are importing wood chips from Brazil in order to keep these power stations going. But many of our bogs still look like this. Now, there is some good news, but you can imagine a scene like this. It's not only devastated from a biological point of view, it's also emitting immense quantities of greenhouse gases. It's also, you can see the drains going up the middle. Those drains are ending up, most of them, as it happens, are going into the River Shannon, and the River Shannon is mostly polluted. It goes back to our rivers. Half of our rivers are polluted. And then also the River Shannon has this enormous dam that was built at Ardnacrusha by Siemens, as it happens, the German company in the 1920s. Again, another amazing leap forward for Ireland in terms of electrification. And apparently at the time it powered the entire country, that particular dam. Today, Ardnacrusha, I think it produces a very ridiculously small amount of electricity. But what it also did was it destroyed the salmon population in the River Shannon. The salmon just couldn't get up the river anymore because there was this enormous wall of concrete in the way, and that has never really changed. And the River Liffey, the Lee, the Erne in Donegal and Monaghan all have these large barriers on them. So when you take all these things into kind of combination, you see that what has happened to biodiversity. You begin to see why biodiversity in Ireland has collapsed. Now, I used to look out at the sea and I used to think, oh, well, God, things might be bad on land, but at least the sea is a kind of a wild space. And unfortunately, that is not the case either. And actually, when I was, I wrote a book 5 years ago about the collapse of nature in Ireland. And I finished up by looking at Achill, because I thought Achill, on the one hand, it had a lot of the problems that I was talking about. And one of those issues was about overfishing. There used to be a herring fishery on Achill. It's famous for the basking sharks, of course, but the piers on the, would it be the south side of the island, used to have quite productive herring fisheries. You can look at the data. They were catching turbot, they were catching cod, whiting, plaice in fairly large quantities with very small boats. Now today there is still some fishing, but practically all the fishing now in Ireland is either done by super trawlers, which are over 20 metres out at sea, like far out to sea, or they're very small boats that are catching crabs and lobsters, basically crustaceans. Fishermen, most fishermen in Ireland, because 80% of the fishermen in Ireland are still small boats, the fishermen in Ireland don't catch fish anymore because the fish aren't there. And one of the problems is bottom trawling. This is the contents of a bottom trawler, because most of our shrimps these days are quite high value, come from bottom trawling. And all of that destruction of ecosystems has resulted in a lot of extinction in Ireland. These are some of the species that have gone extinct. The golden eagle, I think, would have been found around here. The cranes actually have returned. The cranes have started nesting again in Offaly. We used to have a whaling industry in this part of the country. I think it was West Mayo. Someone will correct me. They were hunting Inishkees, yeah. Oh, right, yeah, yes. Just pointing some other one. And they were hunting right whales. They were called right whales because they floated when you speared them, and they were the right whales to hunt. There are no more right whales on this side of the Atlantic. There's only 200 right whales left, northern right whales left in the world along the coast of the USA and Canada. They're critically endangered, and their numbers are still going down because they're getting tangled in lobster pots, and they're being basically knocked over by ships. And the other thing that has happened is not just that things have gone extinct. In my lifetime, so many types of plants and animals have gone from abundant and nearly everywhere to hanging on the verge of extinction. The last species to have officially gone extinct in Ireland is the corn bunting. There's another one there called the nightjar. The nightjar was found in every county in Ireland except Meath, because Meath doesn't have any mountains. The nightjar, there was one record of a nightjar a couple of years ago. That's not Meath, is it? But the nightjar is likely extinct. We heard about the dunlin this weekend. That's down to about 20 pairs. The eel, which I used to find in the streams in the Phoenix Park near my house, is now critically endangered. The corncrake now is up around Donegal, and there are programs for the corncrake, and there's even signs that the numbers are increasing, and people think that that's fantastic, except that there used to be corncrakes in every county. There used to be corncrakes in the car park in UCD. They were considered a nuisance. People were driven demented by them, crexing outside their windows at night. And so the risk of this is that we kind of feel they're up in Donegal, they're doing okay, we're fine, when actually what has happened is that nature has been pushed into these tiny little corners here and there, and we are relying on the heroic efforts of local conservationists, local ecologists, to just keep them hanging on. We saw this morning the efforts that are going into saving the lapwing on the island. They have to be put behind an electric fence in order to keep them in our landscape. We have to be asking, what have we done to our landscape that the little wildlife we have left has to be kept basically under armed guard nearly in order to hang on to it. So that's what I meant when I said I wasn't going to give you a cheery story, because I feel that more than anything, we have to wake ourselves out of the kind of lethargy that we kind of feel, oh yeah, I know it's bad, but somebody else is looking after it. It's going to be okay. The people in Spain at the moment who are, and I mean, I know I was in Spain a couple of weeks ago. It's not that people in Spain are running around panicked over what's happening, because what's happening is quite slow and it's insidious. They've had a drought now for 2 years, maybe even more in some parts of Spain, and their reservoirs are running out. These are very arid countries, and it's affecting their food production. But I think if we are going to address the crisis, we have to feel it. We have to feel it very personally. We have to see it in the areas around us. We talked a little bit this morning about some of the solutions that we have. And we have the solutions, by the way. We know how forests can basically grow themselves. We don't, trees know how to plant and grow themselves. We know how to not fish, because if we didn't fish so much, fish would come back. It's not actually that technical. We know how to farm in a nature-friendly way. We know how to restore bogs. We know how to do all these things. They've been farming in a nature-friendly way in the Burren for 20 years. But we have to ask, why are these good projects staying in little corners of the country? We are still producing beef and dairy. The dairy industry, one of the companies, I think it was Kerrygold, announced its profits last week. I can't remember what it was. It was hundreds of millions of euro. There are people getting very, very wealthy off very, very damaging industries in this country. And basically, we're all paying for it. The financial cost of not meeting our climate targets is 8 billion euro, 8 billion by 2030. Now, that will be because if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we will have to buy credits from other countries who have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions in order to offset the work that we should have done. And according to the head of the Climate Change Advisory Council, who was on the radio last week, that's going to cost us 8 billion. And you have to ask, why would we not spend 8 billion on improving our landscape, changing our agriculture, getting us off greenhouse gases? What's happening at the moment is quite insane, in my view. But to leave you on, I don't even know if it is a positive note, but we have the solutions. We know how to work with farmers to get the results that we want. We know that most farmers are absolutely keen to do this stuff if they were given the right direction and the right incentives. What we don't have is the urgency, and we don't have the scale of what we need. And just on a final point, and I'll give you a nice picture to look at while I'm delivering my final point, because this is what I worked with an artist to try and imagine what our countryside might look like if we actually did all this stuff. And it's not about eliminating farmers, or it's not even about eliminating cattle. It's about just redesigning things and making space for nature. But one of the quite positive things that has happened in Ireland in the last year was the development of a citizens' assembly on biodiversity law. Some of you might have seen this. And they published their report a couple of weeks ago, which I'd recommend you read. It's not that particularly long. And they absolutely excoriated the state. They said the state had abjectly failed for implementing environmental protection measures, including the likes of Natura 2000, including the Water Framework Directive, which was supposed to give us clean water by 2015, our greenhouse gas targets. All of these things are essentially the responsibility of the state, and the state has failed massively. We were talking about it this morning. We were looking at the sheep on the Machair and the bogs that are being cut out, and some of the problems, but ultimately those are problems that have been created because the state has decided to walk away. They basically said Achill Island is never going to be a centre for dairy production that's going to get high prices on world markets, so therefore it's not worth anything. So there's been no investment in anything. When I was in Spain a couple of weeks ago, I visited a Natura 2000 site, a wetland. that had many of the birds that, well, some of them at least, that you have here, ground nesting birds. They had wardens. There were signs everywhere to tell you you were in a Natura 2000 site. There were areas that were closed off. They said that this area, you can't go here for the summer because the plovers are nesting on the beach. You have to keep your dog on a leash. It's not perfect, you know, people break the rules, but nobody can be in any doubt that the rules are there and this is why it's happening. You go down here, and I'm not picking out Achill because I live near Böll Island in Dublin, and basically it's no different. People do whatever they want on Böll Island. And this is the problem, because the state has not taken its responsibilities seriously. So I'll end on that note. It's not that I want to leave you on a downer, but I feel that we can't feel hopeful or that the crisis is in hand until we start taking action. The good news is that we know what to do. The bad news is we're not actually doing it. Thanks very much. Will I stay here?
Thank you, Corey. That was brilliant, wasn't it? So I think we have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions before, throw up your hand.
Yeah, I have a question. For the OPW and rivers, there's been a lot of conflict there between what they do, and they do it for flood relief and everything like that. I mean, is there going to be, like, I don't know whether you have any information on what part of the government do they belong to, and can that have a meeting of minds? Because what the government have for legislation, it's all there, wildlife directives and all that, surely what the OPW do goes completely against that. Like, you know, dredging rivers and, you know, as you say, making them into arrows, straight arrows. So, do you think, like, in a couple of years' time, or even like starting this year, that can be reversed? Because, my God, what they've done to some of the rivers is just shocking.
It is shocking, and it's not just actually shocking. A lot of the time it's illegal. Yeah, but it's quite incredible. There was a story last week in the UK press. A farmer who went into his local river and destroyed 1 kilometre of riverbank in a special area conservation. He was given a year in prison, and he was fined, like, I think it was £500,000 or some very large amount of money. 2 years ago, the OPW did exactly the same in County Tipperary, and nothing happened. There was no investigation, there was no sanction, and that's largely because the OPW designs its schemes, writes its own environmental impact reports, and then decides itself, that's a great report, we're going to fire on and do it, and then if something goes wrong, they're the ones that have to fix it. So it's totally dysfunctional. To answer your question, the OPW operates under the Arterial Drainage Act from 1945. The Forestry Act, this is not unrelated, Coillte operates under the Forestry Act. I think it dates from the early 90s. We also have Bord na Móna, which operates under, I think it's called the Turf Extraction Act, you know. So we set up these state bodies to do certain things that are now totally out of kilter for what we need. And I know, I talk to these people all the time in the OPW in Coillte. They would be quite open about saying, you know, we're kind of on autopilot at the moment because we're legally mandated to do these things. We're given the money. But so it's back to the politicians. The politicians have to step in and change the laws. They have to say to the OPW, your job now is to restore rivers. We have to say to Coillte, your job is not just to make money. That's in the Acts. You must make money. That will be the defining metric against which we measure your success.
So the law's not already there from EU laws, are they not already in situ?
But sure, we've had, in theory, the OPW operates under EU law. They're not exempt, but until somebody takes them to court and proves that, it won't happen. I mean, we're not complying with any of our environmental legislation. We had a meeting, I work for one of the NGOs, there's a number of them. We met with the European Commission earlier this week. I'm sure Michal probably knew they were his former colleagues. I'm not sure which side of the table was pulling their hair out more with Ireland over everything: illegal turf cutting, the lack of implementation of the Water Framework Directive, aquaculture. Our fishing is illegal. Overfishing is technically illegal, but the Irish government is arguing that no, it's not really illegal because we feel that we need to take economic concerns into account. But so there's a group bringing them to court over it. This is unfortunately where we're at. Sir?
I'd like to know from you if there is any movement from the European level to influence the way in which policy is being implemented by Teagasc at the moment, because Teagasc advisors all over this county are telling farmers that they need to clear out their scrubby patches and their wet bits, and to clear out them bushes to qualify for the maximum payments under the single farm payment scheme. And there is a sustained and systematic process of destruction of biodiversity in the landscape around here because of that. Is there any sign at all from a European level via Teagasc that might be changing?
In a sense, it already has changed because we are in a new cycle of the Common Agricultural Policy at the moment. Under the new policy, a farmer can have 50% of his or her land in what they call non-productive features. Actually, they call them now beneficial features. There's quite a nice, they used to be called non-productive features. So you can basically have half of your land in gorse or in a swamp and you will still get your payments. That's very, very positive. But I think what you're talking about is the culture that exists in a lot of these state agencies, because I got a call last week from somebody who lived in Leitrim and she wanted native forest on her land, and her local forester came out and told her, no, this land isn't suitable for trees. You need to clear all that out and dig a drain and then come back to me and we can probably plaster it with Sitka spruce. And so that's what they've been trained to do. So there's a huge job of work. I mean, I don't want to make this sound easy, right? Politicians at the moment do not get punished at the polls for ignoring environmental law, right? No politician. The last politician I know who lost his seat over an environmental issue was Jimmy Dean in County Kerry. And he lost his seat because he had the unfortunate job of implementing rules to stop turf cutting on special areas of conservation, and he lost his seat. So politicians historically have been punished for this stuff. We have to, as citizens, we have to let it be known that they will be rewarded for doing the right thing and that we will punish them for doing it. The media have been absolutely appalling because they haven't communicated anything about biodiversity and they've been dreadful on climate. So I don't want to, yes, the state is ultimately the main actor here and they're the ones that have to lead, but ultimately, this is a societal problem that we have to be dealing with at all quarters. Teagasc is one. I mean, it's obviously very relevant because everything Teagasc does is about expansion and growth and dairy products. They haven't put any investment into sheep in recent years or other things that don't make big amounts of money on commodity markets.
Last one, Orla. Off you go.
I haven't had a chance to look at the documents yet, but I know that they changed the budget arrangement for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. To what extent has that got into hiring the actual labour involved in the re-management of those sites in terms of like invasive clearance, fencing, the capital investment costs that have historically there's no funding for? It could be a training weekend, but they're going to put up a fence. Is there any in the budget line? Is there anything that leads towards staff and capital?
So just for other people the National Parks and Wildlife Service are our nature conservation agency. When we had an economic crash, they took all the money from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and gave it to Bord Bia for their Origin Green programme to sell Irish food as environmentally friendly. The National Parks and Wildlife Service had no money to do anything. Now, they have been reformed. The current minister is Malcolm Noonan. He's a Green Party minister, and I think he's quite good. I think he is a genuine guy. He feels it. They will tell you, right, I'm just repeating what they've said to me. They have told me we are in a 3-year reform process. Everything is wrong with it, everything. These people haven't had email addresses. Many parts of the country have no rangers. If you see somebody doing something wrong, you've no one to call. So absolutely debilitated on every front. everything is wrong. And they would say we're 1 year into a 3-year reform program, and that so far they're meeting all of their targets. So I have asked them, well, can we see your implementation plan? And we've been told we'll see that next year. I know it's incredibly frustrating because you see something on the ground and it seems so easy to fix, and it's not being fixed. I mean, the NPWS don't seem to have the wherewithal to put up a fence, as you say, and then you hear from Owen tomorrow, who has done amazing things on his private bit of land, and Killarney National Park up the road from where he lives is still being taken apart by deer, and you wonder how in God's name can it be so hard to do something. So I have sympathy for them. They are getting back on their feet. I have pressed on them the need to do something that's actually visible, you know, because they'll tell me we've had to reform HR and we've had to reform our IT system. Yeah, and you know, I have to have some sympathy that, you know, you have to build these structures before we get to, you know, the shining summit where we look down and everything is wonderful and amazing. But it's really hard. It's really hard to feel optimistic because there's so much inertia in the system. But ultimately, there are politicians out there who also feel that frustration. And certainly as an NGO, it's our job to be constantly reminding them what they said they would do and trying to hold them to account, rather than necessarily bludgeoning them over the head and telling them they're useless all the time, but trying to work, at least with the ones that want to change. We have to try and work with those, because it's not just for one party, I'd say, with a point. Like, it is for all political parties at every level, local government, everything right up to national, to be working on this problem.
Excellent.
Okay.
So when you're leaving, if you just look at, to follow up on what the Padraic was talking about, that hill opposite, you can see a very clear line where the top of the hill was burned, was it 4 years ago? See that line?
Oh yeah.
And peat just doesn't really recover. Thank you, Padraic, and I'm sure you can corner forward for more questions, because I know that was quite short, but that was excellent, Padraic. Thank you.